Let me try that again and see if I get a slightly heartier response. Good morning. Thank you very much. I do indeed appreciate that. I realize it's an infantilizing way to greet you first thing by having you repeat good morning as if this is somehow kindergarten, but I am the type of speaker who draws considerable energy from the audience, and so if we start out slightly above a whisper, it's not a good sign. It means that you're undoubtedly going to move into an expedited case of rigor mortis, so we're going to try to avoid that. So I appreciate your indulgence. Let me just say, I'm absolutely delighted, honored, and privileged to be here, and I really do mean that sincerely. And I certainly understand, I do this for a living, and I know that the politically correct thing to say at moments like this is, I'm delighted to be here, even if I felt miserably about being here. But in this case, I am genuinely pleased to be here because I was saying to some folks this morning that this work, despite how difficult it is a labor of love. And I was so extraordinarily disappointed last year when it didn't work out, when I was stuck at JFK in New York, and it didn't matter how much time I invested there, the situation just got bleaker and bleaker, and we were blowing up each other's phones. And so I'm grateful to you for giving us ever free to come back again this year. So I really feel honored to be here. And I want to say that I didn't start out with young people being the focus of my work. I'm trained as a clinician, and as is often the case, I think that the work found me. And I think that's probably true for many of us here, that we didn't choose to do this work, but we are among, I believe, the chosen. And not everybody can do this work. And I always like to start with some assumptions I make about this work, working with young people, particularly in terms of trauma and resilience. And I've had to come to terms with with this notion, and when I'm not doing this, I'm actually training clinicians. And most of these clinicians are doctoral level students who come to our program with this passion for working with, as they would say, troubled youth. And we try to do a little bit of a deep dive with them. And what is your interest in working with troubled youth? I don't know, I just have a passion for it. And invariably what happens is that we meet the students, and then I happen to be behind a one-way mirror watching therapy with the troubled youth. And the minute the troubled youth begins to express trouble, they have, like an old feces moment, like, this is not what I thought it would be. Because I'm not sure what they were anticipating. But, they talk to the kids don't talk. Or when they do talk, they tend to lie. And so they immediately get overwhelmed by the work. And this try to abandon it almost as passionately as they were engaged. So I would start by saying, just outlining some assumptions I have about the work itself, because I think it's important. And so what I've learned over the years of working with young people, that I've had to come to terms with the fact that young people, and this is true for clients as well as particularly like the adolescents that we have in our civilian lives, that they enter our lives for one reason only. And that's to make our lives miserable. And that's not a denigrating comment about young people, but rather speaks to the complexity and the enormity of the work. And so if we enter it expecting it to be easy, then we set ourselves up for a long, hard fall. But I also think that we have to be living in a time where it must be exceedingly challenging to be a young person. And I just yesterday, as I heard, as I'm sure you all did, it was in Baltimore, and she was his girlfriend, and we know how trauma works, that you don't have to be on the other end of the bullet or have to be in a school where this happened. You just have to be at school anywhere, and you know the possibility of this happening to affect your emotions psychologically. And so I just think that we're living in very challenging times, and it must be very challenging to be a young person. And sometimes I think the only thing that's more challenging in being a young person is being a person who is entrusted with the care of young people. So parents and teachers and guidance counselors and therapists, that we recognize the enormity of the work. And so I do believe that working with young people is fraught with complexities. It's very hard work, but it's also very exhilarating work. And I wouldn't exchange it for anything that I do. And it just seems to me that, and these are just, like in some ways, have nothing to do with the topic, and nothing has everything to do with the topic. But I do think that, that when I think about like our society's relationship with children, it at best seems like it's a relationship that is somewhat complicated and ambivalent. And that's not always the easy land of people's ears, because we have a lot of feel-good moments about our sentiment toward children. And this has a tinge of cynicism to it, because I do think that it's a very complex relationship that we have. And so on the one hand, we say we love children. And I believe that some of them we do. I think we do love children. And yet, we continue, as a society, I'm speaking now, to take social positions and political positions that jeopardize the well-being of children almost on a daily basis. And I ask myself when I see young people who have done admittedly bad things, and we take this position, well, we treat them as an adult. And to know that our prisons and juvenile detention centers are overrun with kids whose difficulties in life has been criminalized. You good? Good. Appreciate that. And yet, this happens against a backdrop of we love children. And yet, what I think is sometimes I think we're in love with the idea of loving children. But when it comes to actually getting on the ground with kids, both literally and figuratively, we have trouble doing that. And so I believe that one of the harsh realities, and I say this because I'm actually standing here before you, and I tell the young people I work with that I am the embodiment of every child that I work with. And I try not to ever forget that, because it's easy to forget that when I string up my tie and put on a suit. To forget that I was once them, and they are me. It's easy to lose sight of that. And so when I think about it, I do think that we're in love with the idea of loving children. And that if we really be honest with ourselves, we know that even when we love children, we don't always love all children. There's a way in which I think that we love those who are healthy, wealthy, white, and presumably heterosexual just a little bit more. And so if you find yourself as a child and you find yourself strapped along the margins of our society, the borders of our society, that you're the child of an immigrant, that you have the misfortune of growing up poor, that English is not your first language, that you're black or brown, there's a way in which this mantra that we have, we love children, always doesn't extend, it doesn't reach the barrios and the inner cities and the lives of many children of color, those who are pushed along the margins of society. And this is a very difficult conversation to have, because it creates a discomfort, and the next reaction is to shut it down. And yet, because I'm the embodiment of the kids I work with, I can't come here in good conscience and just say all the things that are politically correct to say. And so I always think about this notion when I'm watching two adults actually engage in debate or discussion that's a little bit heated. And invariably one adult will say, "Don't talk to me like I'm a child. Don't talk to me like I'm a child." And I always think, my gosh, if it is indeed so awful to be talked to as if you are a child, then maybe, just maybe, we need to reconsider how we talk to children. Because if it's not good enough for me, what should be good enough for a child? What should be good enough? But we never think about that. And so for those troubled youth and traumatized youth, we seem to only be able to focus on their problems and less on their pain, and even less on their untapped potential. That we rigidly compartmentalize young people into these broad, rigid categories. Good kids, bad kids, and mad kids. And so the good kids, we hold them out there to emulate. The bad kids, we punish and incarcerate. The mad kids, we medicate. And we never stop to think. We never stop to think. Because bad kids are colored in our society. That, you don't take my word for it, but you look anytime that there are white kids who do bad things, there's an underlying empathy for them. The conversation immediately shifts to their traumatized life, the difficult family situation they grew up in. But when kids of color do bad things, they are bad kids. Very little empathy for the complexity of their condition. No place to recognize their pain, and even less space to recognize their untapped potential. We never stop to think that maybe it's possible for good kids to do bad things. Maybe it's possible for bad kids to do good things. And when it's so rigidified and so compartmentalized that we end up bifurcating these issues. And so it's good kids and bad kids that get pitted against each other. And so much of my work has been working with traumatized youth and also trying to take a trauma-informed approach, which has at the center of it resiliency. And so I'm not only concerned about who the young person is currently, but also who does she or he have the potential to be. That's always a part of my work with young people as well. It's not just about who you are and how you show up in this the worst possible manifestation of your life. It's about who you also have the potential to become. And so I always ask, there's not a young person I see in therapy, there's not a young person I have in class, that I don't ask the following question. Who is, or what was it that you were destined to be before trauma shaped you into who you are currently? So don't want to dismiss the pain of the moment, but don't want that to overshadow the notion about at the point you entered this world, you had the same ideals, the same possibilities any other child had. And somewhere along the way, something happened that altered the course of your life. And because it altered the course of your life, it should not foreclose, suppress your ability to think about who is it or what is it that you were destined to be. And so that becomes the piece of work that I focus on. That is the first step toward finding the hero within. And so much of my work centers around these four critical aggravating factors, which I think are also constitute major invisible wounds, invisible trauma wounds in the lives of young people. And so I wanted to just tell you what they are, and then I'd like to talk with you about them. And there's a way in which I'd like you to think about these. I'm going to talk about them in the only way that the English language permits me to talk about them, in this very linear fashion, A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4. But the fact of the matter is, as you think about them, I'd love if you think about them as having a very rich synergistic interplay. They're really sort of inextricably tied together. And you don't see one without seeing the other. And in fact, I always like to suggest that if anybody here who's, I don't know why you would have had occasion to study this, but I'll put it out here anyway. Anybody have ever had any exposure to, like, mice or roaches? Now, I know everyone will say, no, not me. Okay, so what one knows, or what you have been told by someone who knows about mice and roaches and the phenomenology of them, that if we were to see a mouse here, and so you're wondering, oh my gosh, you better write keynote address here. If there was a mouse or roach, it very likely would be somewhere out there where the food is, running along the baseline. And for those of us who have spent time thinking about the phenomenology of mice and roaches, we know that you might actually observe one darting along the base point. But to the experienced eye, to the novel eye, you know that that one you see is not the only one. That there's a whole posse of them somewhere else that you can't see. But you know that for sure. Now, some people are shaking their head affirmatively, which you know. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that these aggravating factors, these invisible trauma wounds are very much like mice or roaches, that you may see one that's prominently displayed in a young person, but you should well know that the others are also there, even though they may not greet the naked eye. So the first of these wounds is devaluation. And what devaluation is, by definition, is it's a process by which an individual or group is stripped of the essentials of their humanity. So stripped of the essentials of their humanity. So the shorthand of this is that what devaluation does is any experience that you have that assaults your sense of dignity. It assaults your sense of dignity. And devaluation is like a slow-moving, undetected cancer. It eats away at the core of one's being. And so what we know about devaluation is a couple things. One is that there are two principal forces that contribute to devaluation. There are situational forces and there are societal forces. These situational forces refer to circumstances like abuse, neglect, abandonment. So any child who's been exposed to abuse, neglect, abandonment is going to experience devaluation. But there's also, and that's pretty well understood in our field, and that we acknowledge that. It is the societal forces that contribute to devaluation that we have a hard time grappling with. And the societal forces speak to conditions like the traumatizing effects of poverty. It has to do with racism. It has to do with homophobia, heterosexism. And so what I'm suggesting is that when you have children who are also dealing with those issues, they're essentially experiencing devaluation on the basis of just being born a person of color. And there's a way in which, so when we talk about kids of color, no matter what class they are, whether we're talking about kids we work with or the Obama kids, it doesn't really matter, that if they're born kids of color in society, they're experiencing devaluation is emanate from sociocultural trauma. And if we're talking about kids who are born poor, it doesn't matter what race they are. That poverty has this way, it's a very complex phenomenal thing, and that it can be responsible for the beacon of our creativity on the one hand, but it also scars the psyche and the soul. And so to room this size, I don't assume that everybody here was born middle class. And so if you're born here and you're born poor, what you know is that though you may not be poor today, you you still carry the wounds of that experience, because that's how incredibly piercing and debilitating it is. And so when we talk about kids who have actually been exposed then to the situational forces, abandonment, abuse, neglect, but also the sociocultural forces, we're really talking about children who suffer with complex trauma. And so the therapy to just focus on whether your father was in your life or not barely scratches the surface in terms of what these children need. And so what devaluation does is that it pierces the soul. It assaults one's sense of dignity. And when one has been devalued, it places a very high premium on respect. So much so that respect becomes that which you're willing to die for. And we ask ourselves, who would be so narrow-minded and myopic that you'd be willing to die for respect? Who would be so fragile intellectually and psychologically? And the answer is simply this: anyone for whom respect has been hard to get. If you live your life being disrespected, that you will die for it. And so I understand when I have young people come to me with all the appropriate bravado and the invincibility, this mask of invincibility, and they cluster on, I'd rather die than be dissed. I'd rather die than be dissed. I understand at the core of that is not just this resolve and sense of resignation one has about their untimely death. It's about this quest for respect and how valuable that is for those who've been disrespected. And that's what devaluation is. And so there's a way in which that I always absolutely abhor when adolescents I work with go before the juvenile justice system. And they're carrying this incredible cancer-like wound of devaluation. And they're sitting before a judge, and what the judge is looking for is some sign of remorse, some sign of contrition. But this clinging on to respect doesn't allow that. So the kid shows up with all the bravado and this mask of invincibility, and it becomes like one hell of a power struggle between the judge and the kid. Because what I'm praying for and hoping that judge can be beyond that mask of invincibility and see the incredible vulnerability that sits in front of him or her. Well, that's hard to do. And so our response is always to punish, and punish, and more punishment, and more punishment, that we have punished ourselves into a quandary. It doesn't affect people. So in addition to devaluation then, the second wound has to do with this erosion of community. Erosion of community. And I use community as a metaphor to really speak to a sense of relational connectedness. Relational connectedness. And that we serve young people a rather daunting task where we expect them to live healthy, viable lives without the benefit of community. Because we are indeed, all of us here, we are a relational being. We live our lives in a relational context. And if there's anything we know about relationships, the relationships have the power to hurt. When I think about the pain I've had in my life, it's always at the hands of some relationship. There's a relationship that I want but couldn't have, had but didn't want, couldn't have it the way I wanted it. There's always a relationship that's implicated. The relationships have the power to hurt, but they also have the power to heal. And so what happens with many young people is that there's a way that's supported by this sort of text messaging, Instagram world we live in that sort of reinforces this kind of disconnection. And so when you take the lethality of devaluation and you couple that with this erosion of community, and there are minimally 3 levels of community that really should constitute the focal point of our work. So there's primary community, which has to do with family, and however one defines family, whether it's mother, father, or with my dog, Jamar, it doesn't family. And for many people, it's their gang. a gang. And I don't know why we seem surprised when you have a gang member who's willing to die for his G. Because even among us, I think, given the right set of circumstances, we would surrender our lives to someone that we love, that we feel powerfully connected to. And so there's primary community, which has to do with family. Then there's secondary community, and extended community, which has to do with school, church, temple, mosque, synagogue, the places where kids participate, where they learn how to make that critical transformation from me to we, to be part of something bigger than themselves. And then the third level of community has to do with cultural community. It's where kids have this deeper understanding of themselves in terms of what it means in our society to be male or female or queer, what it means to be Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, what it means to be black or African American, or all the other things that so many of us are, so we get some sense of clarity about that. And so what I believe is that when the children do well, when those three levels of the community are relatively stable. I think the reverse is also true. I think children suffer when all three of those levels are disrupted. I think if one of them remains relatively intact, it's a powerful mediating factor. And so the fact of the matter is, our children, nor we, can live and thrive and be viable without the benefits of community. Now, the third issue has to do with dehumanized loss. And so you show me any child that's in any system of care, and I will show you a child who has suffered dehumanized loss. And so, first of all, I think that many young people today live lives that are inundated with losses. So if you think about, like my comments just about community, if your primary community is disrupted, that constitutes a loss. If you are estranged at school, that constitutes a loss. Because most of the folks here that raise their hand or are connected to schools know this, that we're living in a context now where for many young people, school is the new community center. It's where a lot of kids remain in school, not because of their zest and zeal to learn, but because it offers the last bastion of connection in their lives. And school becomes like the new reformed community center. Not saying that's explanation, not justification. But loss inundates the lives of traumatized youth. And the way it works is that when one's losses have been failed to be acknowledged and mourned and properly grieved, then what happens is that loss actually loses its humanness, so that that no longer has an affective response to loss, because loss is so commonplace. And it's almost as if many young people develop this mentality, unconscious to them, that, well, I've had loss after loss after loss after loss, and it hasn't mattered to anyone. Then why should your losses matter to me? So loss becomes dehumanized. And when loss becomes dehumanized, it loses its humanness. That young people lose the ability to have any empathy for losses that comprise their lives. And again, why this pains me so much is that these are things we look at that then to justify punishment. It's what fuels us toward a punishment-oriented response to young people, particularly when and where they're hurt. And so that loss loses humanness. And when there's loss that's unacknowledged, unmourned, and ungrieved, then that loss becomes dehumanized. But not only does it become dehumanized, that it becomes a precursor to rage. Now, what I believe about loss is that for young people who are devalued, all aspects of their lives are devalued. So that we don't quite care the same about the loss of poor kids as we do the loss of middle-class kids. We don't respond the same way to loss of kids of color in the way that we respond to the loss of white kids. And so when you're devalued, all aspects of your life are devalued. And so when there is then this dehumanized loss, it plants the seeds for rage. And rage is the fourth aggravating factor, it's the fourth invisible trauma. And I always think it's important to draw a critical distinction between anger and rage. That I think that anger is a much more immediate emotion. It's episodic, anger is. So, for example, I noticed this morning as soon as I got here that there were these little chocolate muffins out there on the breakfast stand. And I immediately grabbed one and showed it to Monique and said, I don't need this, but I'm eating it anyway. But I couldn't trust to wait till the break because I had to wait for the break and they were all gone. Then I would have experienced anger. Anger. Well, that's not rage. And I think it's important to draw a distinction between anger and rage. Because rage is an experience that is inextricably tied to experience of domination, devaluation, and ultimately trauma. So rage is what you have when something happens to you. And that is not the same as for anger, which is a much more immediate episodic emotion. And so we can put as many anger management programs in schools as we wish. They simply don't work because the kids are enraged. We can come up with all sorts of protocols with wonderful acronyms that are brilliant that we use for anger for kids. They simply don't work because the kids we're talking about have been traumatized and what they have is rage. And we don't understand the anatomy of rage. And not only that, I would ask you to think about this. Where would be the appropriate place for a young person to deal with rage? Certainly not in Church Temple Mosque Synagogue. You can't express that rage in school. And here's the thing that I find most dismaying, and I say this as a licensed clinician. You can't even express it in therapy because many therapists are rage phobic. And so you get a young kid in their young Chicano in therapy who actually wants to talk in a very passionate way about what hurts him and what infuriates him. And what do you have the therapist doing? With Olympic-like speed, grabbing the tissues and thinking it's altruistic. Or, I can hear you better if you lower your voice. Well, the fact that you can't hear it at the decibel that's taking place is our problem, not the kid's problem. Then we get all didactic and tutorial. Well, let me give you the proper language to express what you're feeling. But with the kids, I don't give a damn about your proper language. And rather than being able to sit in that uncomfortable place, we take care of our own comfort level. And so I ask, so you know where most enraged young people end up? Particularly enraged poor people of color? In detention, in jails. In jails. And because we can't see beneath the part of it that frightens us. And so I believe that when you've had these traumatic experiences, you cannot not be enraged. And when one becomes enraged, there has to be some way, shape, or form for that enraged to become outrage. And we can't actually do anything about it until it's outrage. But if we're uncomfortable with the outrage, then what happens is it just lives inside of the individual and just slowly eats away the interior of that person. And so it is a complicated mixture, if you will, of these four things that come together that creates the kind of dynamic that we see in traumatized youth. And it really makes the interventions very difficult, whether we're talking about in school or mental health, that what happens is that we treat all these issues as punitive criminalized issue is. It's unfortunate. And we don't have enough detention centers or enough jails to hold all the hurt people who end up hurting other people. And it's incumbent upon us to be able to understand this better in all of its complexity. And that's why being here today is so important to me, because I sit in my office with young people and I go through these superficial antics with them about finding a time to meet next week. I suggest next Wednesday at 4, and they think about it and check their phone. Nah, Doc, I can't do that. What about Wednesday at 6? Nah, I have basketball game. We go back and forth, and what I'm sitting realizing is, our biggest challenge isn't finding a time that we have in common to meet next week. Our biggest challenge is whether or not you'll even be alive next week. That's the severity of it. That's the severity of it. And so I think that what it means is that we need new ways of thinking about this work. And I appreciate so much you suggesting that not getting saturated in the trauma, but also thinking about resilience. How do we help lift up and pull out of these circumstances? And so so a major piece of my work then is about this notion about finding the hero in every young person I work with, because I believe that every young person has that hero that's somewhere embedded down there beneath the piles of devaluation, buried so deeply under the rubble of the losses of their lives. Because here's one thing I think we do in our society. I think we underestimate the impact of trauma in kids' lives. And I think we actually sometimes overestimate their resiliency. And so that we don't take it, we don't understand. I mean, like I see this, that a child who's moving in first grade and crying hysterically because Molly is his best friend and he'll never ever have another friend like that. We know that's unreasonable. We know that's unrealistic. But that child doesn't. I still remember my father and his impotency in trying to help me in a struggle in my life, because I maybe this is just me, but I don't know, but I just think something about that first love in your life that I think it's such a critical developmental experience, because I think with your first love, I don't think we love anybody the way you love your first love. And unfortunately, that first love happens very early in life when you're young. Well, when I was young, dumb, and naive. And so there's something about that first love, and I always think in our society it's fascinating. We talk about like falling in love. It's an interesting concept. And how it's not the same once you regain your balance. Well, I fell in love just uninhibitedly in my adolescence. And as these early love relationships often do, they didn't work out. I was devastated. I was absolutely devastated. I couldn't ever imagine finding another person on the planet that I'd feel that way toward. And I went to my father to talk about this. And he was so ill-equipped and so inadequate. He said all the freaking things that were not helpful. But he thought he had my back, but it didn't help. He said, "Oh, Kenny, don't worry." He had all these slogans. There's plenty of fish in the sea. It had to do with what I'm feeling right now. I don't know why you're talking about fish. And I couldn't think metaphorically. And say, you were looking when you found her. That's not helpful. I needed him to sort of deal with my pain, and for him in his infinite wisdom to understand that yes, there will be another, but I'm not gonna. That's not where you are right now. And so there was a way in which I struggled with that, and he couldn't quite ever grasp it. And I think oftentimes that we underestimate the impact of the pain that young people feel. And so this notion around finding the hero within is based on a model I developed, which I call the VCR model, if you will. The VCR model. And the VCR, that the V is for validate, and the C is for challenge, and the R is for request. And I kind of wish my father had used this back in the day when I was struggling with pain if I lost a loved one. And so the VCR is a strength-based model, and it uses to work with traumatized youth. And the V stands for validation, the C is for challenge, and the R is for request. And the underlying principles of the VCR are that every individual, no matter who he or she is or might be, has a redeemable quality. And that we have to search for the redeemable quality. And that whether we're a teacher, guidance counselor, therapist, youth worker, whatever we are, that each of us has the capacity to only see what we look for. And so my hope is that with the VCR, it helps us to look for something differently, so therefore we can see something different. Because I think we see what we look for. So if we, in our work, if we look for pathology, we find pathology. If we look for that pearl of functionality that's embedded in a web of dysfunctionality, we're very likely to see it. And so the VCR suggests that we should look for that which is redeemable. And that one of the guiding principles of the VCR is that if I'm working with young people, or when I'm working with young people, I don't have the right nor the license to challenge a young person or engage in any of the nasty C's that we often deal with working with young people. I don't have a right to challenge them, correct them, criticize them, chastise them, condemn them. I don't have the right to do any of that until I first validated the young person. And the validation is not the same, it's not tantamount to agreement. And in an experience like this, in a workshop like this, what I'm suggesting sounds so incredibly easy. We think about it cerebrally. But in the moment, when you factor in human emotion and human interaction, it's very difficult to do. It's like my sitting with a 14-year-old girl that I work with. Her name is Samantha, she goes by Sam. And at 14, she has been multiply abused in her life by her father, her grandfather, her stepfather, all. Have treated her body like a playground that belonged to them. And so she came to me because she's been arrested something like 35 times. And she's been arrested for public indecent exposure. She was actually dancing in these little corner bars where she was actually partially stripping, but then also performing oral sex on men, not coincidentally, who were old enough to be her grandfather, and arrested multiple times. And so in therapy, she's had this very harsh demeanor. So I'm having conversations with her about my search for the hero, the shero within, if you will. And I'm validating her, and she's saying to me, F you. So that's the response to me saying, I really appreciate just how powerful your voice is. I don't give a shit about what you think about my voice. You think I care? You can take that and ram it, she says to me. I say, see, there it is again. Like, you could have easily just not said anything, but the way in which you have this incredible voice. It's a very powerful voice. And she said, you know what? I'm just going to say, you sit here, I hadn't even realized this part. You sit here with your goddamn matching tie and socks, and you think that you impress me? You don't impress me. I don't give a shit what you say. That's her response to me. So essentially, I'm validating her, and every validation I extend to her is responded to with a Scud missile back to the soul. It's very personal. One day, I even on a Friday, I wore jeans to work, and just to be honest with you, maybe too much information for you, but so I had them rolled up at the bottom, underneath, arm at the bottom, so they stayed up like they were creased. Didn't fool her. I'm sitting in a session, and she said, What's with this? Don't you make enough money to get your pants hemmed? So again, I'm focusing on her voice. You know, like it's a powerful voice she actually. Like, why do you keep talking? Let me look at read my lips. Look at me. I don't give a continental F about what you think about my voice. How about that? So this speaks to how difficult it is to validate. And that when I think about it, that she had absolutely no reason whatsoever to trust me. When every person who looks like me has violated her, I'm not entitled to that. And so I could have easily gotten to the point where I've tried to reach out to you, and all the language we use in therapy, you're resistant, you're recalcitrant, you're hard to engage. And then perfectly justify it. No, it has some other therapist reads, oh, brilliant notes. But the fact of the matter is that what was happening there was powerfully therapeutic. Because I was probably the only man in her life where she could take that kind of aggressive, egregious approach and actually say those things she was saying to me, which weren't pleasant. And actually not be aggressive on it. And so validation, I don't wish to oversimplify it. It's not easy. Because part of it is that it's not the same as acknowledgement, but it's about being able to see through the soul of the young person that we're sitting with, to hold in one hand all the horrific things they've done, and on the other, search for that hero within, because it's in there. And that we don't have a right to even get into, like with her, I never challenged her, I never criticized her. Basically what I did was to continue to validate her. Because here's what I believe: when we're the adults working with young people, and if we're actually serious about finding the hero within, it means that we have to be the experts on vulnerability, while we give young people the space to be the experts on invincibility. When we get that confused, we lose that child. When I now have to become the expert on invincibility, you're not going to talk to me that way. Do you know I'm Dr. Hardy? It's like an act of masturbation. I feel good because I've spoken on my behalf, but I'm going to lose Samantha. And so it means staying in that murky place, believing that beneath all of that venom, all that aggression, that there's a little shiro there in her, dying to get out. And it's my job to be able to find that, to cultivate that, to nurture that, to give it the space for it to be birthed. And it requires me to be less self-focused, more self-sacrificial at that point. And so there was a point where I continued with her, there's a poem that she wrote to me that I've always had trouble reading without tearing up, because to have seen her where I saw her, and then to her to write this. And she says, here I am, little old me, sitting in awesome of you. Here you are, in awesome of little old me. Thank you for your ability to see in me that which I was never able to see. Absolutely brilliant. That to take those few words and to weave them together in such a powerful way, that it impacted me. So when I said earlier about the work being difficult on the one hand, this is the exhilarating piece of it. That she titled this Little Old Me. And she kept resisting this notion that there was anything redeemable about her. And why should she? Why should she accept me seeing in her what she wasn't able to see in herself? When the treasure of her has never been valued, that she's been treated like trash in her life. And when that happens at the hands of the flesh of your flesh, if you can't trust the man who is responsible for bringing in the world, how can you trust any man? But she was the embodiment of everything I talked about. Because the reason she could, and I remember saying to her things like, these difficult conversations, I said, you're really, putting yourself at risk there, and you're allowing yourself to be demeaned when you deserve more than that. She said, I'm not being demeaned. You see this? And she showed me some fake Rolex watch. And see, this is what I get. And I said, but you know what? But you have so much talent. I said, I give speeches for a living, and I make a lot of money doing it. And as I was saying to someone this morning, to you, I said, and I still get nervous when I'm in front of a crowd. I said, the fact that you can get in front of all these men and do what you do and not feel nervous, like, do you realize how incredible that is? That what you could do with that ability. And I had colleagues who criticized me for that because they felt like I was condoning what she was doing. I'm not condoning what you're doing. I'm getting her to try to see that hero within. And that's that slippery slope we have to walk. For her to recognize that it's not about, this fake world. I'm in awe of you. I'm amazed that you could, in front of all these people, put yourself in such an incredibly vulnerable position and master that so well. I know some part of what that's like because I'm always nervous. But searching for that hero within. It's about seeing what's redeemable in her. Not dismissing all that she's done, but being able to hold that with one hand and search for the other piece of that. That's what it's about. And so with the VCR, I recognize that I don't have the power or the right nor the license to criticize anyone until I'm appropriately validated. And how do we know when, and see, here's what happens, that the best medication on the market, the absolute best medication on the market for devaluation is validation. And yet, we have a hard time validating because we have no trouble validating someone if they're engaged in behaviors that we support. We have trouble doing that delicate surgical procedure if they're doing things we don't approve of because we worry that the validation is tacit approval to what they're doing, that we don't appreciate. And we have to be able to perform that delicate surgical procedure to separate her ability to manage herself and work a crowd from what she's actually doing. That when she's assaulting me in the therapy, which it was assault, to separate from that, hey, what I'm saying in this therapy behind this assault is her emerging voice. And I need to help cultivate that voice, even if it's contributing to my misery in a moment. That's what it looks like. And it sounds easy in a workshop like this, but in the moment, it's not easy to do. And so the other piece with validation is that it does require us that we have to, when we're doing this search, when we're searching for the hero within, we have to eliminate the word B-U-T from our language system. We have to eliminate the word B-U-T because B-U-T is the ultimate validation eraser. I think you have a powerful voice, but it completely deletes everything before it. And young people who've been in this, if you had a young person who's been in foster care, been in the system, or in the juvenile justice system, their ears are so acutely attuned. They know the real message is not even delivered until after the word but is used. And so it's not just that the use of but is semantically complicated. I think philosophically it's complicated because I think, when I was talking earlier about this notion of either good or bad, that we're in this sort of paradigm, this United States paradigm, where we think in terms of dualities. And so what I'm wanting us to do, if we eliminate but and we use and instead, then we're embracing both and. That you can be good and bad simultaneously. You can be bad and do good things. You can be good and do bad things. Where one doesn't have to necessarily negate the other. Now another part of another principle of the VCR, that when we're searching for this hero within, I recognize that I don't get to decide how long I validate the person with whom I'm speaking. that I don't get to decide that. I don't get to decide, okay, I've validated you, now I'm going to move to see the challenge. That I take my cues from you. So as long as Samantha and I were having a conversation, and everything I said to her was rebutted by her with some negative comment toward me, suggested that what that situation needed was more validation, not less. And that's very hard to do. It's hard to continue validating someone when they're attacking you. But the power of validation is that it conquers that every single time. And I don't think we can get to the hero within if we don't continue to validate. Because here's the fact of the matter, that if you've lived your life on the margin of society, where your own parents have not seen value in you, that it's hard to trust that anybody sees value in you. And I find that young people who've been severely devalued are, in some ways, the most challenging young people to work with, because if you criticize them, that they have a very strong reaction to criticism because they've been so profoundly criticized much of their lives. And the only thing that engenders a much stronger response to criticism is validation or affirmation. So I find that when I validate a young person who's been profoundly criticized, there's almost like a very strong negative reaction, because the negative reaction is that, are you trying to play me? Oh, you think I'm stupid? Because the dominant story in your life has been that you ain't nothing, never going to be anything. And now suddenly I see value in you. That it's easier to not trust it than to open yourself up and be vulnerable to even entertain the possibility this person who sees something of value in me could possibly see that. And so it's very difficult to do. So with the VCR, we start with the V, which is validated, and that we find that redeemable quality, and we build on that. And once we do that, we can go to the C, which is a challenge. So I'm now saying to Samantha, you know, you have this powerful voice, that you have this charisma, that you're able to move and motivate a whole room of people. That's your gift. That's your gift. And the challenge is, and there's a way in which you're using it that is harmful to you, and you can do this without the harm to yourself. And so that they are, I'm making a request of her. So my request is that you recognize whole and continue to cultivate this incredible gift that you have. And also think about ways in which you can use it where it doesn't have to pierce your soul, it doesn't have to take away from you. Is that something you're willing to think about at this point? And that's where our work begins. But what happens is that it's very difficult for us to embrace the VCR because we, as a provider, we get threatened, we get challenged, we get triggered. So I have a student of mine, former doctoral student, named is Michelle, who works in a group home. And she just called me a couple weeks ago, and she was saying, Ken, I need your help because I have this farting problem. And so I knew right away then that she was working with boys because I don't know what it is about the male gender and farting, but there's some intrigue there, which now that I'm a tenured professor, I'm free to explore this empirically. See, what is the intrigue? So according to Michelle, she's in this group home and she's working with a group of adolescent boys. And one of them just continues to fart. And that she has, as she said, I'm up to my wit's end. So she told him that, and those who work on people know, so the way it works is he farts and the rest of the group laughs. So they laugh, it just encourages him to fart more. So she said, just before she called me, one more fart, and the whole group is going to lose privileges. You're going to lose privileges. Now, what's fascinating to me about this is, it's a typical response that we adults take when we're confronted with out-of-control behavior with young people. So she says, one more fart, and you're all going to lose privileges. So they lost privileges, but then once they reconvened, the party continued. So she wanted my advice about what to do about this. And so I'm just going to tell you exactly what I said to her. I said to her that I think you should, it always comes back to me, it always starts with validation. I think you need to validate this young man. How do I validate farting that stinks in the room? So I had to model it for her. I said, so in your group, you're turning to him and you're saying to Bree, I've noticed that you fart on demand. That is an absolutely incredible feat. Like, where did you learn how to do that? How did you recognize you had that skill? Because it's one thing to burp on demand. It's totally a different level to be able to fart on demand. So why are you wasting your time here farting on demand for cheap laughs from your group members? With this skill, you can go places. Now, this was useful because it helped to change even her thoughts about it. But that's about, maybe you beg to differ, but that's about finding the hero within. That, whether we like it or not, it's a talent. And in some ways, that he had the same captivating effect on his group members as Sam did on the places where she was dancing. And so once she framed it that way, that she certainly could be able to solicit his help, because now if he's feeling appreciated and valued by her, there's less need to draw the line in the group sessions to actually be in a competitive relationship. And so I'm always asking folks asking folks like ourselves, what is our capacity to find and see the redeemable aspects in another person? Not just in clients, but in general. That it means that I have to think about, like the Vegas shooting, for example, and think that in the midst of the horror and all that he did, what is redeemable quality? Because what I believe is that this VCR, it sounds like a strategy, and there's an element of it that is a strategy. But the most significant piece of it is, it's a worldview. It's about how we see the world. And are we able to hold complexity? Are we able to see pathology that's embedded in functionality? Are we able to see that? Because if we can't, if we look at another person and we can find nothing redeemable about that other person, then that is a problem with the observer, not the observer. Because I haven't, and so when I'm training for this, saying, I want your eyes to be trained to see what's redeemable. Because what I know is that's where hope lives, that's where hope resides. And if we fail to see that, then our approach is one where we think that a situation is much more hopeless than it is. I thought the same thing when I received a referral for a young boy who was a pathological liar. That was the referral, pathological liar. And so I asked him, are you a pathological liar? And he said no. I said, is that a lie? He said no. I said, so you do tell the truth? He said yes. And so I asked him, do you lie? He said, I'm not going to lie to you. Yes. So we're off to a great start. So then, again, like I'm saying to him, so how did you learn the skill? How did you learn it? And how do you use it to benefit you? And right now, I mean, like, you're cheapening your benefit because you're using it to get out of going to class. That's such a small payoff. Do you realize how powerful and how valuable this skill is that you have? Do you realize this? Do you realize that it's the same skill that great authors have? This imagination to be able to create things that don't exist. Why not do that? Do you realize that there are some people who've been able to ascend to the highest office in the land with this skill? With this skill. Why are you wasting it on your math teacher? Think big, my brother. Think big. Think presidential. That's finding the hero within. And what I believe is that every young person who comes before us has that. And it may well be we don't like what they're doing. It may be that gang member who has these incredible interpersonal skills to mobilize a group of disaffected young people and get them to believe in something. That's a skill. That's a skill. It's the drug dealer who's pushing drugs, who failed math, but can actually make incredible computations in his head that I need a calculator to use. That's finding the hero within. And we can't leave, it's not incumbent on young people to find the hero within. It's our job to be able to do that. And what often precludes us from doing it is our own judgment, our own reactivity, our own ways in which we get triggered. And so I think that this work with young people and to move young people from this place of trauma to resilience requires us to ask ourselves a critical question, actually two critical questions. And the first question is, who is it and how is it that I wish to be in this work? Who is it and how is it that I wish to be? That they're a critical question we have to ask ourselves about ourselves. And then I always think that for those of us who do this work, because what I believe is that, as I said from the outset, I don't believe that not a single one of us in this room chooses to do this work. That it's not what we choose to do. The pay sucks. The rewards are slow coming. But we're recruited to do the work. That we're recruited to do it, and not everybody can do it. And so we have to ask ourselves, the second question is, what is it that I wish to be in this world? And I think minimally there are three possibilities. And so one is that we can choose to be a jailer. We can choose to be a helper or a healer. The choice is ours. And so what a jailer does is a jailer is a person among us who sees the principal focus of the work is around correction. That the jailer is interested in the perpetuation of the prevailing order. That the familiar refrain of a jailer is, I don't make the rules, I just reinforce them. Another familiar refrain of a jailer is, I'm just trying to do my job. But I think when it comes to young people, and particularly young people hurting, sometimes I don't think just doing our jobs is enough. It requires so much more than that. And so there's also, and I think at a time when these complex times in which we live, when there's so many young people who are having complex difficulties, that what we offer them has to be more than simply correction. and corrections. And so there's a helper. And what the helper does is the helper is the type of person who's always there to pick up the pieces when pieces fall apart, because pieces do in fact fall apart. And so the helper is always there to lend a helping hand. But what the helper doesn't do is take on an activist position. The helper is not going to stretch oneself to actually say, no, this is wrong, this is not good for kids. Because they're there to pick up the pieces when they shatter. But they take a less active role in preventing these things from happening. And then there's the healer. And what the healer does is to believe in the possibility of the impossible. That the healer says that the way it is not the way it has to be. That the healer is a visionary. That the healer sees one's job in much the same way that I try to see my job these days. That I travel a lot, and it used to be that I would get on a plane, and before my tush could comfortably engage the seat, that the person next to me was asking me this dreaded question. Exactly. So what do you do? I hate the question. I'm flying from LA to New York. If I say I teach, the person next to me says, well, I took an undergraduate course in psychology back when I went to Cornell. So for 4 hours, 5 hours, I figured out this course. So I no longer say I teach. Then I'd say I'm a therapist. Then it was, I believe my 14-year-old daughter is sexually active. So then I hear about all his paternal fears about his sexually active 14-year-old girl. When what I need to do most is sleep. So I stopped saying it. I started avoiding it. And then I started thinking, answering that question for myself about who is it and how is it I want to be. And I have a very definite answer to that. And so that liberated me. And so now when I travel, as late as yesterday, as I'm hoping, praying, even at times trying to bait the person next to me to ask me, what do you do? Sometimes I even slip my business card in the tray or my book in the back pocket, trying to seduce them into asking me, so what do you do? Because I do see myself in this work as an aspiring healer. And so just yesterday in North Carolina, in Charlotte, the guy next to me bought the baby. What do you do? And I looked him square in the eyes as I do these days. Sorry. I looked him square in the eyes and said, I'm in the hope manufacturing business. And I work with children. And my job with children as a hope manufacturer is to hold hope in places where hope has long since ceased to exist. Because that's what our kids need. That we can't liberate ourselves to find a hero within if we're not in a hope manufacturing business. And so if we ask that question for ourselves, and I'm hoping that each of you will choose, as you think about who it is and how it is you want to be, that you would choose to be the sort of aspiring healer. It's not a destination, but that we're working on behalf of young people. That we will say not what is politic to say, we'll say what our kids need us to say. That we will be able to look at children and see them in a much more complex way. That beneath that incredible mask of invincibility. There's a tremendous amount of vulnerability. And that the way it is not the way it has to be. And if for every young person sitting in front of us or standing next to us and walking behind us, if we dare take the time, if we dare look, then we're very likely to find the heroic thing. Now, I believe this because I had these incredible parents who tolerated me and all of my fantasies growing up. And that only thing I ever wanted to do or be in my life was a disc jockey. And I'm sure worried and scared to hell of my parents because I'm in the third year of my doctoral program and they're asking another dreaded questions. What are you doing next? And all I know is I was a sitting DJ for spinning this disco kind of music. And my parents, I know it had to frighten them, but they never once deterred me, they never once criticized me for it. I think they, in their infinite wisdom, saw some piece of a hero within me. And because what I recognized was that, like, music is very much like therapy. That in therapy, I use words, and in music, I use words. And therapy is about excavating people's stories and telling stories, and music often tells a story. And so I'm grateful to my parents for not squashing my hopes and dreams and ambitions. And so I want to end today. And I have to tell you, I'm not comfortable doing this, but I'm stretching beyond my comfort zone. Want to share a video, Crystal, that I use as a tribute to children. I think it's about being the manufacturer of hope. It's about recognizing how children's lives are inundated with jailers, and what they so desperately need are healers in their lives. So.